Welcome. Joining us today is self-proclaimed expert on monopolies, James Livy.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. First, I want to ask you, how common are monopolies?
So you run into an interesting problem there because there's no such thing as 100% market power monopoly, which is, the true monopoly that everyone talks about. What you have is you have some firms that do have high market share, and so they do have some market power. But when you're trying to define how much market power someone has, or a firm has, you run into the problem of, how do you define the market? Because you can define the market to make any firm look like it has monopoly power if you define the market narrowly enough. So for example, let's take Microsoft. If you're going to define the market as Windows operating systems, okay, then yes, Microsoft is the only producer of Windows operating systems. They look like they have a monopoly. But if you expand the market to include all other operating systems, then they have a lower market share. And if you expand the market to include all computer producers, then they have an even lower market share. So it's hard to define, how much market share a firm has. And the firms that actually do have a large enough market share to affect prices significantly are relatively low.
I see. But with these firms that do possess a high market power, what problems could they potentially present for, let's say, consumers?
So that depends on where they get their market power. Because if they get their market power from somewhere arbitrary, like government, just pointing at a firm and saying, you now have monopoly power, regardless of how efficiently they're producing, then yes, you run into problems, because they're going to restrict output and raise prices and make things worse for the consumer. Mm-hmm. But there are naturally arising monopolies of efficiency. So what you have, is a monopoly that actually runs more efficiently than many firms would. And a situation like this can arise if, for example, you have very high entry costs into a market. So let's use an example of oil, right? It costs a lot of money to buy all the equipment you need to drill for oil, and then to refine the oil into something useful, and all the pipelines you need to transfer the oil, or all the barrels you need to transfer the oil, depending on where you're drilling from, things like that. This is all incredibly costly to just produce the first barrel of usable oil. But after you've produced the first barrel and you already have all of that capital in place, it's relatively cheap to make the next barrel and the next barrel and the next barrel. So it's less efficient if you have a bunch of firms, each producing a relatively few number of barrels, but all having to pay the high cost to create all the machines you need to drill and complete the whole process. But if you had just one firm only being the only person to pay for all the machinery in the beginning and produce all of the barrels of oil, that would be the most efficient outcome, or the most efficient way of doing it. Another way you can have monopolies that are beneficial instead of harmful is when you just flat out have a company that outcompetes its other companies. So the reason they get monopoly power is because they do it more efficiently than everyone else who is already in their market. And they will temporarily have monopoly power until another firm comes in and figures out how to do it as well as they do or better.
Now talking about these efficient monopolies, how would regulation of these efficient monopolies by government affect growth?
Well, so if a government comes in and says, we're going to break up all these efficient monopolies, you're going to lower growth, because monopoly power is one of the biggest incentives for innovators to come in and try to outcompete their competitors, and in doing so create more efficient products. So if you do have a government that comes in and says, okay, every time you win your competition, right? We're gonna break you up and make you not, get rid of your personal gains from doing this. No one's even gonna bother.
Right.
So what will end up happening is growth will stagnate if government comes in and regulates all the monopolies that exist.
That's very interesting, Libby. I wish I had more time, but that's all we have for today. I want to thank you again for being with us.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.